only generate instinct impulses and instinct feelings as well as an instinct psyche. As a result of the blockade and deflection of the feinstofflich or fluidal, electromagnetic fields of energy which surround him, the human being only perceives effective reality in a very restricted way, and that is the case with the majority of all humanity. Truly, few and far between are human beings who allow their energy to flow freely towards and into the pineal gland and therefore can perceive by seeing or by hearing things which belong exclusively to the feinstoffsinnlich realm. And it is also these human beings for whom it is possible, with sufficient meditative practice, to perceive, by means of spiritual fine sensitive feeling, even that which is super-feinstoffsinnlich, which belongs to the spiritual realm and is therefore far beyond all energies and powers of the consciousness. However, what there is to say in regard to this is that the super-feinstoffsinnlich form is not possible with the earth human being in view of his still insufficiently developed evolution of consciousness, which will remain the case for a long time yet. Nevertheless, however, every earth human being who is capable of rationality and understanding is capable, with the corresponding meditative effort, of awakening, developing and making useful the feinstoffsinnlich within him. The fact is, in regard to the feinstoffsinnlich, that not only are those human beings who can see, subject to a day and night rhythm, to which all body functions even the pupils are also adjusted, rather the blind are also as are all blind creatures. So, from that it also follows that the blind and especially the blind perceive that which pertains to the feinstoffsinnlich and are therefore especially active in terms of spiritual fine sensitive feeling. Naturally they also perceive the material realm, yet their spiritual fine sensitive feeling capabilities are more pronounced than the capabilities of those who can see, and, indeed it is because they direct their energies onto the inner eye, or put more precisely, onto the pineal gland. Besides, also with the blind, the retina is interwoven with special nerve cells through which signals are transmitted to the pineal gland. This stimulates the production of the hormone melatonin which steers the inner clock, and so determines the life rhythm of the body. The human brain also has still other remarkably important factors at its disposal besides the pineal gland, as, for example, the early warning system, which is situated near the frontal lobes, in the region of the brain named the anterior cingulate cortex, called ACC for short. It is this region of the brain which then becomes active when, for example, there is a difficult decision to make, such as among other examples when a decision must be made between two conflicting alternatives. However, the ACC also warns the human being of threatening or emerging dangers which are only perceived with the spiritual fine sensitive feeling, and consequently do not penetrate into the consciousness as a direct warning factor. A further factor is that which relates to the perception by means of spiritual fine sensitive feeling of sounds which do not emerge as effects pertaining to the material senses and can also therefore not be materially perceived but rather as infrasound, as is emitted, for example, by large animals or earthquakes, and so forth. Infrasound is actually also the origin of some inexplicable phantoms, which, for example, come about as a result of the wind whistling through holes, through rock crannies, through chimneys or cracks, and so forth, and producing extremely deep tones which cannot be registered by the human being's hearing, however the vibrations of which affect the human being's body and naturally also the pineal gland, and release certain effects of a feinstoffsinnlich form which are perceived with spiritual fine sensitive feeling. The radiating impression of the personality is the radiation factor which is also designated the aura, and it is this which can be perceived, by means of spiritual fine sensitive feeling, by other human beings when they are sensitive enough, that is to say, when they can consciously use the energies and powers of the pineal gland, and, thus, the spiritual fine sensitive feeling. The fact is that every human being is surrounded by a feinstoffsinnlich, or fluidal, electromagnetic field which contains the information about the personality, for which reason the imprint, or the radiation, of the personality, is also called the information field, none of which, however, has anything to do with esoteric nonsense, just as it has nothing to do with the alleged and deceitful mediums who falsely boast out of image-seeking and profit-greed, that they can see auras. And this fluidal, electromagnetic field also has an effect on one's fellow human beings and, with sufficient sensitivity, it can be perceived and identified by them. This fluidal field of the human being's personality is therefore able to make contact with his fellow human beings and influence them. But such an influence also occurs through the thoughts and feelings when these are concentrated on another human being or on an animal, because through this concentration, through the feinstofflich vibrations of the thoughts and feelings, a strengthened, fluidal field comes about, which expands and strengthens as a field of effect whereby the targeted fellow human being can receive and identify the message. The fact is that the human being's personality and entire body uninterruptedly transmit feinstofflich electromagnetic vibrations or signals, which are perceived by other human beings, unfortunately, as a rule, however, only unconsciously, because the human being has turned himself towards the atrophying of his pineal gland as a result of the change of direction of his inner world towards a purely rational intellect. A further fact is that every living and dead body, that is to say, all organic material, has its own source of light which radiates from many and varied cells, its feinstoffsinnlich light, that is to say, fluidal light, together with fluidal energies, because every living cell emits quanta of light, or via photons, in tiny amounts in the UV range. These radiations, or emissions, or auras, can be perceived by every human being through spiritual fine sensitive feeling, and, given a certain sensitivity, can even be seen. Unfortunately, however, as a rule, this is taken advantage of by those who are partial to the esoteric, and by deceitful, clairvoyance, and so forth, when they assert that they can see human auras, and so forth, because truly that is only possible for human beings whose pineal gland functions to a great extent. Human beings with such capabilities are, however, rare, consequently it is easy to recognize that the majority of capable ones walks the paths of mendacity, deceit and swindling, or simply of charlatanism and profit-greed, pushing its mischief and tricks and leading its fellow human beings into error. In the current time, clairvoyance and the reading of thoughts often emerge as a result of incisive events, that is to say, traumatic experiences and events through which the human being again turns to his inner world, as, for example, when he is struck by a serious illness, through the loss of a beloved human being, as a result of a physical impediment, through a catastrophe, a terrible experience, or through a tragedy, and so forth. Unfortunately, today's human being lives more unthinkingly in the moment instead of turning to his own effective inner and outer life, whereby he could also stimulate and utilize his pineal gland activity and capability in regard to spiritual fine sensitive feeling, or feinstoffsinnlich perceptions, as, for example, with a view to clairvoyance and reading thoughts, or even actual telepathy, that is to say, the conscious willing and steered conveyance, and conscious reception, of thoughts. Also belonging to that is the perception by means of spiritual fine sensitive feeling of joy, hate, love, illness, honesty, dishonesty, sorrow and lies, and so forth, yet, in the previously mentioned sense of incisive events, that is always based on damage to the personality. But normally that is not the case, because all the capabilities of clairvoyance, thought reading, clairaudience, actual telepathy, as well as teleportation, levitation and telekinesis, and so forth, can be achieved without incisive events, by human beings, and indeed by every human being who possesses clear rationality and is capable of understanding through practical and ongoing meditation practice. Therefore, the simple reading of thoughts, as well as actual telepathy and all other forms which pertain to the consciousness as energy, that is to say, to the thoughts and feelings and stipulated by the pineal gland, can be made consciously comprehensible for the human being. but that is conditional on a controlled hygiene of the psyche and tirelessness in regard to the necessary meditative efforts. Feinstoffsinnlichkeit also plays a very important role in regard to the near-death experience because, when the purely rational rationality is turned off by the dying process, and the seventh sense, the spiritual fine sensitive feeling, is put into its appropriate place, the perception capacity, which is usually repressed in the current life by the condition of rational rationality, expands in regard to the feinstoffsinnlich. Thereby a border opens, for the human being, to a window into that feinstoffsinnlich world which extends very far beyond all that which can be perceived with the purely material senses, with the eyes, touch, smell, hearing and tasting. Through this heightened ability of perception in regard to the feinstoffsinnlich, through the spiritual fine sensitive feeling sense, clairvoyance, for example, emerges as a near-death experience in such a way that the dying human being views himself from a higher vantage point above his own body, or floating through rooms, and can also see what happens around him, what is being discussed, and what objects people carry or are present in the room in which the person is dying or in adjoining rooms, and so forth. The near-death experience is also a key to the reading of thoughts, whereby the thoughts of the people standing around, or of those who are far removed, are perceived on a feinstoffsinnlich basis. That happens especially in the deep or deepest stage of death throes, which correlates to a state constituting the least brain activity. This status is that of the entrance into death, and, in this state, the brain opens up to the human being his concealed capabilities which are repressed in his current life. Every brain, therefore, that of the human being, as well as of all creatures, can be compared with technical transmitting and receiving devices, because every organic brain is a transmitter and receiver for feinstoffsinnlich energies and their powers as well as their effects. These feinstoffsinnlich electromagnetic vibrations, with their energies and their powers, are along with those of all other creatures available in their billions from human beings, and vibrate through all space and through the ether. If the human being consciously directs his perception at these fluidal vibrations, then he can receive a great deal of information, yet, if he diverts his perception away from them, then he can no longer perceive that information which flits past him unnoticed in the sphere of the seventh sense, that is to say, in the sphere of the spiritual fine sensitive feeling capability, although these data are constantly present all around in infinite number. These are innumerable data, pertaining to human beings' brains, also animals' brains, which constantly have an effect all around, which are, however, not perceived by the human being due to the atrophying of his pineal gland, because he is ruled by purely rational intelligence and he displaces the feinstoffsinnlich. As a matter of fact, in the entire universe, everything is based on information of a creational nature. Consequently, nothing is left to so-called and non-existent chance or chaos. Rather, everything, and indeed also all matter, is based on information. Truly, everything therefore has its order determined by information which manifests itself through the law of causality, that is to say, the law of cause and effect. Likewise, the thoughts and feelings of the human being and so forth also do that, and, as with atoms, they move freely in space and time. For this reason, it is also the case that if the brain shuts off certain parts of its faculty of perception in regard to the material realm, as, for example, through shock, as a result of illness, dying, accident or terrible events, and so forth, then the possibility arises that the brain now perceives information in the feinstoffsinnlich realm, which then also penetrates into the consciousness and which is otherwise displaced by that which pertains to the material senses. It is not the case that, in order to be active in a feinstoffsinnlich way, the consciousness sensor, factor, or consciousness feeler, factor must first leave the brain, because it is only when rational intellect is shut off and the feinstoffsinnlich gains the upper hand, that the consciousness becomes active and can send out its feeler, or its sensor, which is able to make feinstoffsinnlich perceptions beyond the body. Since time immemorial, this feeler, or sensor, of the consciousness, has been described as a silver thread which goes out from the perceive the material realm, yet their spiritual finely sensitive feeling capabilities are more pronounced than the capabilities of those who can see, and, indeed, it is because they direct their energies onto the inner eye, or put more precisely, onto the pineal gland. Besides, also with the blind, the retina is interwoven with special nerve cells through which signals are transmitted to the pineal gland. This stimulates the production of the hormone melatonin, which only generates instinct impulses and instinct feelings as well as an instinct psyche. As a result of the blockade and deflection of the feinstofflich or fluidal, electromagnetic fields of energy which surround him, the human being only perceives effective reality in a very restricted way, and that is the case with the majority of all humanity. Truly, few and far between are human beings who allow their energy to flow freely towards, and in regard to the feinstoffsinnlich, that not only are those human beings who can see, subject to a day and night rhythm, to which all body functions, even the pupils, are also adjusted, rather the blind are also as are all blind creatures. So, from that it also follows that the blind and especially the blind perceive that which pertains to the feinstoffsinnlich and are therefore especially active in terms of spiritual fine sensitive feeling. Naturally they also please to say in regard to this is that the superfeinstoffsinnlich form is not possible with the earth human being in view of his still insufficiently developed evolution of consciousness, which will remain the case for a long time yet. Nevertheless, however, every earth human being who is capable of rationality and understanding is capable, with the corresponding meditative effort, of awakening, developing and making useful the feinstoffsinnlich within him. The fact is, too, the pineal gland and therefore can perceive by seeing or by hearing things which belong exclusively to the feinstoffsinnlich realm. And it is also these human beings for whom it is possible, with sufficient meditative practice, to perceive, by means of spiritual fine sensitive feeling, even that which is superfeinstoffsinnlich, which belongs to the spiritual realm and is therefore far beyond all energies and powers of the consciousness. However, what there